Okay, if you would like to turn over to Esther chapter 9, we're going to go ahead and pick up our Bible class there. Last week we went through Esther chapter 8 and took a look at the elevation of Mordecai to basically the I don't know what you call it, regent or whatever, but basically the second in command of Persia, and the command that was sent out by Mordecai and Esther with the king's authority to authorize the Jews throughout the Persian Empire to defend themselves against their enemies on the day of that had previously been declared as the day that those enemies could attack and destroy the Jews. And so we finished by looking at the fact that, as I think it was Ken maybe that pointed out, as somebody who pointed out, it wasn't me, I know that, the fact that there was a marked contrast between the way that the city of Susa had reacted to the order of Haman, which had caused confusion and unease, and the order of Mordecai, which caused joy and rejoicing and happiness. And it suggests that in general that would indicate that the Jews were generally held in favor, or at least that there was certainly a great deal of confusion as to why that entire people should be annihilated. And so when that situation was reversed, that the people in Susa and elsewhere felt a better sense of that was a more appropriate outcome, I guess, is probably the best way to say it. So,
why couldn't the Jews have defended themselves without this decree?
I think that was asked last week, and I think that what it comes down to is when you have the weight of an official decree behind you and against you, either behind you, in favor of you, or against you, there is a presumption that what is being done is legitimate and responding against it is illegitimate. So if the Jews were to defend themselves, there would be the concern, the risk that the imperial or the government forces of the Persians might become involved in also.
They may have defended themselves without authority.
They might have, but they probably would have been less successful.
Yeah, it would have proven Haman's point too.
Well, that's true as well, or potentially anyway. Yeah. You can look at if you look in more modern history, and you look at the situation in Germany, for example, prior to the actual Second World War and prior to the beginning of what we would think of as the formal Holocaust, Jews were increasingly marginalized and ostracized and increasingly under. The government initially was doing things to make it hard for them to act, but they weren't directly attacking them. But they made it clear to the general public that it was perfectly okay to do that, and that was what was happening. And the Jews found it very difficult to defend themselves because they knew that if they did, the actual government of Germany would take direct action against them. And so, despite the fact that the government was making, and that the people of Germany were making the situation increasingly unacceptable and difficult for them, the Jews only ever once or twice actually took up arms to try to stop it. And the primary situation was in the Warsaw Ghetto riot, which by that time was completely unsuccessful because the situation had gotten even more out of hand. But I think there's a big difference between the notion of let me defend myself against someone who's trying to break into my house, or someone who's assaulting me on the street, or even 2 or 3 people who might be doing that, if I've got the right tools to do that with, especially, and trying to defend yourself against an unnumbered and unnamed enemy that can be anybody around you. It's almost impossible as a practical matter to defend yourself under those circumstances, especially when the government has made it clear, because of the fact that they've sided with one of those parties, that you are the ones who are expected to lose. So I don't, I think they could have defended themselves, perhaps they would have defended themselves, but the circumstances and the response of Esther and Mordecai would suggest that neither one of them thought that they would have had any chance of being successful in that defense. So, yes, ma'am.
I still think too that with the second edict that they could defend themselves, they were less likely to be plundered by the general public, where before there was nothing to stop them from doing that because they were going to be annihilated anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true. one of the things we think about is mob mentality or group mentality. And when you see, a lot of times when you see large groups of people doing really bad things, if you look at the individuals inside of the group and you took them out of that and said, would you do this on your own? Most of them wouldn't. But what happens is that when they're operating with a larger group, there is a sense of entitlement and freedom to do things that you would not otherwise do. And so the mob or the group empowers people to do things that they would not do otherwise. And so in the situation with the original edict, given that there was this commandment, given that there was these, the right to plunder them, I think that what you would have seen is a lot of people who maybe otherwise wouldn't have done anything who would have gotten involved. And that's why I say it gets a lot harder to figure out who your enemies are when they can be anybody. Whereas once the second edict goes out, the Jews can basically figure out, okay, who are our actual enemies here? And be pretty confident that the people who are not those actual enemies are not going to take action against them because they know that the government no longer favors that. And the government is no longer supporting that. And by contrast, if you remember one of the things I pointed out in the order last week, one of the things that, so the incentive, as it were, for the people to attack the Jews was the ability to take their stuff. The disincentive for someone to oppose the Jews was that the Jews were then authorized not only to kill and defend themselves against whoever came up against them, but also to kill anyone who was related to them, to kill their families. And so suddenly there's a much higher consequence if you do this and if you don't win. And so I think when we talk about that, when you think about, when you think about an order that says anybody can do this, people start thinking, well, this is easy pickings, no problem. And then when you have this other order that says, and they can fight back and they can make things really bad for you and your families, then you start thinking, I'm okay the way I am. I think I'll just stick with my stuff and not mess with the Jews. So.
I think the last verse in chapter 8 reinforces what you just were talking about. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And then this is really critical. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting because that particular passage is used by some anti-Semitic groups to argue that most of the modern day Jews are not actually ancestrally, genealogically Jews, that in fact they're fake Jews. But that's not a conversation for today's class. It's just an observation that I came across a couple of years ago. But yeah, so it does create a wave of conversions, or at least of conversions in name, to avoid this, because there is definitely this fear. And the other thing about this that's kind of, if you just think about this in the terms of the big picture, the king is pretty clearly kind of a neutral party in a sense in both situations. He authorizes Haman to do whatever he wants to without really taking a lot of responsibility for it. He authorizes Mordecai and Esther to do whatever they want to without taking a lot of responsibility for it. But in the first situation, when the first edict is issued, the guy who's in charge, who's really making the day-to-day decisions, is who? What's that? Haman. Haman is the guy making the decisions, and he obviously hates the Jews and wants bad things to happen to them. By the time the second edict is issued, who's in charge? Mordecai. He obviously has the opposite perspective. He wants the good things to happen to the Jews, he wants bad things to happen to their enemies. So while the government, in a broad sense, if you use that word in sort of a collective idea, while the king might be somewhat neutral, if the guy who's the second in charge and who's making most of the day-to-day decisions is in favor of one side over the other, that puts whoever's the favored side in a huge advantage over the disfavored side. And there is always the possibility that the favored side is going to have the benefit of imperial money and reinforcements and whatever else they might need in order to make sure that they're successful.
Kind of like the home team advantage on steroids.
There's an element of that, and the reality is that most people can read the tea leaves on this. This is not a hard thing to understand, that the weight of the government was pushing one direction, and now the weight of the government is pushing a different direction. And just like we don't want to get in God's way, you don't really want to get in the way of an empire like Persia, And so the average person seeing this is going to recognize the futility of going against the Jews under those circumstances. And that basically, like I said, it shaves the number of enemies down to absolutely the ones who are the most dedicated. And my guess is, given that we've seen already that Haman is an Agagite who is actually descended from the Amalekites, that it's probably not just random people who don't like Jews, that it's probably people who have ethnic and historical enmities toward the Jews, like the Amalekites did, and some of those other groups like that, that those are the ones that the Jews are going to be still needing to deal with. If anybody's going to do anything, it's going to be those kinds of people. So that's what I think what we're looking at here at this point. So, okay, can I get somebody to read for me chapter 9, verses 1 through, let's go through 10.
Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshandatha and Dalphin and
I wouldn't worry about it.
Aspatha and Koratha and Adalia and Aridatha and Harmashta and Arisai and, man, he set me up here. All of them, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder.
Okay, so so there's kind of two interesting degrees to which one could argue that what happens here goes beyond the king's actual edict. What would you say? What would you identify as the respects in which what took place went beyond the official edict itself? What are the two things that kind of jump out at you?
Well, the officers and the governors and all that help.
Okay, so one of them is there's nothing in the order that said that the officers and governors are supposed to help. Why do you think they did that?
Because of Mordecai's influence.
Okay. So again, reading the tea leaves, it's pretty obvious, you're not going to get in trouble if you help the Jews. You might get in trouble if things don't go the way they're supposed to in your area of the empire. So it's kind of like, you see this. We see this even in our government today, where the people who are bureaucratic, who work for they're part of the executive branch and the legislative branch, they may not have a direct order that tells them what to do with certain things. In fact, they make a lot of the rules themselves. But how they apply those rules may shift from one administration to another, from one Congress to another, based on who's in charge. So under Obama, for example, the IRS had gone into a program of investigating people who were Republican donors, they were beginning to investigate churches who had what I would actually could consider to be somewhat dubious tax status and things like that, because they could tell that was things that the current president was okay with them doing. Once Trump became president, the reverse began to occur. The IRS began to do investigations of those who were Democratic allies, and they were given a clear mandate from the top, from within the IRS, to hands off of churches and stuff like that. So whatever you feel about the politics of that, the point is that the people who are carrying out the orders generally have a sense of who's in charge and what do we do to make them happy. How do we make sure that we don't get the negative attention? What do we do? And so one of the things we see, obviously, then is that these local government officials are helping the Jews. They're not simply permitting this to happen. They are actively aiding them in the process. Jared?
I was just thinking about another example that you're talking about would be sending $4 billion worth of arms to Ukraine. I
don't know. I tend to suspect that either administration would have that outcome.
Well, I'm saying it's the administration that's helping.
I see what you're saying. They're helping out that side, yeah.
And they may have slipped some weapons to the Jews.
Well, yeah, that's a good bet. So
That just reinforces the fact that
if the Jews would have defended themselves without the authorization to do so, they would have been.
It would have been the other way around most
Yeah,
likely.
they would have been, it would have been governmentally enforced.
Yeah, and likely it would, even if they would probably have been the kind of the very similar situation that once the day comes, the distant officials are going to line up to help out, even if there wasn't a clarity over whether there was going to be this. But the core of that is if you fight against the king's edict, you're in rebellion, you know. And so the king's edict before the first edict was kill the Jews. There's nothing about defending yourself. So if you're going against the edict, you're in rebellion. Now the interesting thing is on the other side of it is with the new edict, that because it didn't overrule the old edict, those who would have chosen to go to attack the Jews would not be considered to have been in rebellion, strictly speaking, but clearly the local officials understood that they were better off siding with the guy who was in charge and not with the guy who was dead now, you know. And so there's that aspect of it. Now, go ahead, Ken.
There's two other things that struck me as we were looking at. One, they didn't take the plunder.
Okay, yes.
It was, reminds me of, many instances in the Old Testament where plunder was used. Abraham, when he went out and, got Lot back, and he didn't take the thing, but, basically let the young men take what they had eaten. And then the other thing that struck me is the specificity of killing the 10 sons of
Right. Right. Because the edict authorized them to kill the family members, and it seems like they really wanted to take out Haman's family, which, why would that be important? I mean, other than just sheer revenge. Any of the other reasons it might be important.
prevent it coming back. Okay,
so one of the things that you see, and it's not a very nice aspect of imperial succession, is that generally speaking, when a king succeeds to the throne, and he's got brothers who are similarly aged and competent, he'll get them killed one way or the other, or send them off to war or something like that, because it's not good, it's not healthy to have an immediate rival for the throne. And in the same way, it's not healthy to have a family that's bent on destroying you around, where they might find some way to do that, whether it's legitimate or not. And so it's just a smart thing to get rid of these sons of Haman, because they could become the future Hamans, they could become the future threat. So, okay, now there is one other thing I wanted to kind of point out in terms of how I think what actually happened went beyond the actual orders that were given in the order that the king sent out. Anybody notice anything else about how this went down that seems to go beyond the actual order of defending yourself?
It appears that the Jews hunted.
Okay. It seems to be a much more proactive kind of a thing than just let's see who attacks us and then let's defend ourselves. There's a real sense when you look in there, it talks about they assembled throughout the cities. They laid hands on those who sought their harm. No one could stand before them. These are the kinds of things that are associated with going out and doing bad things to other people, not to waiting until they come to you and doing things back. It's kind of like my favorite, one of my favorite characters, minor characters in the Bible, the Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who serves King David, and whenever he goes and does something to someone, it's referred to as falling upon them. There's no other human being in the Bible that's described as falling upon other people. The only other thing in the Bible that's described as falling upon people is what?
Haman and the queen.
What's that? Well, falling upon a couch, yeah, but I mean, like, actually falling upon someone. What's
the Spirit?
The Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the thing that falls upon people. Whatever Benaiah did to those people was bad. And so he was a scary dude, and I think, when we talk about it this way, this is a very proactive kind of thing. So it looks like the Jews didn't just wait for the bad guys to come to them. They went looking for the bad guys to get rid of them. And you can understand the logic behind that, even if it does exceed the edict, because here again, if you don't do something proactive, there's always the risk that something is going to be done to you later when you are not in a situation to defend yourself, when you are not assembled together in a group, that people are going to come after you and sort of try to pick you off or whatever. So it makes sense that they would do that, and certainly given, again, the direction the wind is blowing, the Jews have a great deal of confidence that they're safe in doing that. That they're safe in actually hunting down their enemies and putting an end to them and not having to wait for them to come and actually formally attack them or threaten them or something like that. And it's possible that in many cases that was built based on previous threats that had been made and previous statements that had been made, and so the argument could be made even within the edict that even though they had not directly attacked us yet, it was clear that they were going to or that they wanted to, and so because of that, we were still operating within the bounds of defending ourselves. Steve?
Well, maybe a modern similar reference would be when we invaded Kuwait and Iraq and Desert Storm. We went in, defeated them soundly right away, drove them off, drove them back, but we never removed the leader. And he came back. And,
Yes.
And so this to me is like the Jews are saying, we're going to get rid of all the way to the head of the snake, and we're going to be done with it.
Yeah. Yeah, you always, if you don't deal with the root of the problem, you always have the risk that it's going to come back or to come back in some form. You could make the argument that in many ways, the situation that we're dealing with Russia right now is a product of us not dealing with that situation completely, but being content to basically say, okay, the Soviet Union has fallen, the country's in chaos, rather than actually trying to either step in and help with that or do something to try to create a situation that was a good situation. We were content to accept, hey, they're not an immediate threat to us anymore. And the result is that rather than having something better coming out of that, the possibility for even maybe true democracy or reform coming out of that, what it is eventually has morphed into over a series of different changes is a very totalitarian government with just the form of democracy behind it, but not the reality of it, doing very, very bad things. And we've never dealt with that, and now we're having to deal with the consequences of that and of our choices to kind of ostracize Russia during the period of time when they were struggling to move past communism. I saw Ken's hand and then I got Steve. Oh, I didn't see Ken's hand. Okay, then Steve.
So this is not uncommon in the world. Even recently, General MacArthur wanted to go into China.
Yes.
But look at what we're dealing with China right now. So he was not given permission to do that. And you look at, well, like you say, the Soviet Union, and then the political argument is, well, should the United States be the police of the world? Well, the problem is, how much do you want to spend? Because if you don't try and tinker with it, at least at some level, you're going to be paying a lot more later.
One of the interesting arguments, especially in the 70s and in the 80s and 90s, was the question of, is it more cost effective to not engage and let things get worse until you have to do something big, or to simply bite the bullet and do something to start with and prevent it from getting bad down the road? And in general, that was one of the key differentiations between liberal and conservative views for that period of time, was that issue. Interestingly, that was a transition, because in the 1960s it was Kennedy and Johnson who actually believed that we should be proactive and deal with that stuff. And over time there was a transition from the liberal and the liberal view of let's be assertive kind of became the liberal view of let's leave people alone, and the conservative view of let's minimize the amount of money that we spend and the amount of lives that we risk became it would be better to risk them now than to risk more later. And so there's kind of been this transition between these two ideas. But yeah, that is kind of an ongoing question, is, are you really helping the situation by prolonging the outcome and making it possible for the other side to get stronger and stronger and stronger? We can certainly see that in World War II with the approach that was taken to Hitler, the appeasements that were made, and then ultimately how utterly unsuccessful that particular approach was.
And there's emerging issues today that we don't know the outcome of.
Yeah.
We have the Iranians that are developing nuclear weapons, probably. We're not stopping that. We have North Korea. That's a huge problem. We're not changing that. China is emerging to be a global, absolute global power.
And the problem with some of those is the complexity of dealing with some of those issues. For example, North Korea, the problem with North Korea is North Korea now has the largest single set of artillery and missiles aimed at South Korea that anyone's ever assembled in one place to aim at one enemy in all of history. And no matter what we did, if we attacked South Korea. However we did it, the result would be catastrophic for South Korea and probably for that whole peninsula, because it would almost certainly at this point become a nuclear conflict. And so part of the problem is how long we let them build those things up instead of dealing with it. But to deal with North Korea would have been to deal with the Chinese, and that was what MacArthur was not given permission to do at the time. So there's a complexity now, and sometimes things get more complicated now because of the things that we didn't do then. And it's difficult because you also deal with to what extent, if we do things like that, are we going to create local resistances? That's what we saw particularly in Vietnam, where trying to go in and help people in ways that was destructive to their own land created a larger and larger guerrilla force that was fighting against us. So I rarely criticize politicians for these kinds of decisions, because I think it's very, very difficult to make the right decision in the moment. And when you have the benefit of history, sometimes even then it's hard to figure out what the right decision was. So it's challenging, but we have certainly left ourselves with some very dangerous opponents, and not any clear way to take care of them.
So the text to me, and I'm interrupting my daughter, I know. The text to me that we're reading shows clearly the same mindset that we have today. Back then they had an opportunity, they said, we're going to take the initiative.
Yeah, there's no question. Sarah?
To add on to that, I think that in this situation, they had one day, where sometimes we view it as in the future.
Yeah.
They seized the moment because you don't know whenever this moment's going to come, which I think is also why they chose 10 sons to annihilate before another king was persuaded in a different way.
Yeah. Well, in that context, it's kind of interesting to think about, there's a lesson that they may have learned from Egypt and from the Egyptian captivity, that everything was great when Joseph was in charge, but eventually the kings arose who had forgotten about Joseph. And once that happened, the situation was very different. And so it makes sense that the Jews would want to get rid of anybody who might become their opponents, because that same process very well might take place in the Persian Empire as well. So, what's that? Yeah, exactly. Who's this Mordecai person? And okay, maybe he was helpful, but that was a long time ago. Nobody's tried to kill me. I don't need to keep rewarding his people for this. So, there's definitely a lot of good reasons to do this and to do what they did. And again, it talks about, that they're killing their enemies. It's not just they're killing anybody they think are their enemies, or they're killing anybody that they are, that's got the nice stuff that they want. They don't even take the stuff. So there's definitely a targeted aspect to this. And it's also important to recognize that while the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, there are any number of times that the Jews do some very very widespread violence to people that God has sent them against, it's always with God's explicit permission to do that. And here at Esther, although we don't see that, because as we've said, God's name is not specifically mentioned, the circumstances and situation make it clear that that's what God wanted, and they have the authority of the government to authorize them to do this. So this is not just them going on some sort of campaign without anybody's permission or without any sort of guidance in what they're doing and just killing anybody they want to.
In my ESV study Bible, the introduction, it says that they were still a group the Jews were a group living in exile. And it says, as a minority group, the Jews were viewed with suspicion and sometimes faced threats to their existence from people in a position to harm them. Mm-hmm. So they were still living with that, even though they had been there for 114 years.
Yeah, that's true. And that would always be true in the future, with the exception of the nation of Israel that was later founded. Even Israel, once the Babylonians let them go back, there's only a brief period of time where the Israel as a nation, Jewish nation at that point, is sovereign, and then soon after that the Romans take over, and from that point on they're either a subject peoples or they're dispersed until the nation of Israel is created in the 1940s. So I saw another hand, I think, perhaps not. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. No, I can't read my own watch. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left here. So somebody read for me verses 11 through 15, please.
On that day, the number of those who were killed in Susa, the capital, was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in Susa, the capital. What then have they done in the rest of the king's province? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you." And And what is your further request? It shall also be done. Then said Esther, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. And the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month, Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting conversation to me, because where it seems to be going, what the king is saying, is not where it ends up at, which I think is kind of an odd situation. So the king gets a report of how many people have been killed in Susa, which is the only one he's going to get that same day, because everything else has to come by messenger and horseback and whatever else. There's nobody calling him up on the phone and texting him or whatever saying, guess what, you know. So he finds out that you know, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the city of Susa. And then he says, what then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? It sounds like what he's headed towards is, this is nuts, we should probably stop now. But instead, his question is, what else would you like to do? So it's like, you know, it's going really well, I guess, as far as your group of people is concerned. What else would you like? And of course, Esther's request is, give us another day here in Susa to kind of wrap things up. Now, she doesn't ask for that to be done throughout the empire, and there's probably 2 reasons for that. Anybody want to speculate as to the 2 reasons why she wouldn't have asked for the rest of the empire?
Same reason you didn't have a death count. It's the communications.
Okay. No practical way to let people know, and that's the biggest one, I think. And there's another one, though. Anybody want to think about why Susa would be the most significant?
Well, that's where your capital is, that's where the people of influence would be.
Okay, so that's the other big issue, is you want to get rid of all the people who have influence, who have real power, and most of them are in Susa. Now there's the provincial governors and some of those, but they're distant from the throne. It's the people close to the throne that you worry about, because it's Haman who got the king's ear and got him to do what you want. He was there in Susa. So you want to get rid of the people who are in particular positions of power. She also wants to hang Haman's sons on the gallows. Why in the world would she want to do that? They're all dead, right? So what's the point of that?
Make an example.
Okay, so this is the same logic that has heads on pikes outside of castles, that has the particularly horrific torture and death device of putting people in cages and suspending them from the battlements until they basically starved or died from being attacked by animals or whatever else, but then their bodies were left out there for sometimes months and even years to remind people, you know, not to do this. Hanging is definitionally designed to be a public event that people see and are influenced by in terms of how they think about things. And so even though they're dead, hanging them up like that is still a powerful message to the people who might threaten or oppose the Jews in the future. So that seems to be the logic anyway behind that. So the king gives the command, issues another edict, and sure enough, the Jews in Susa assemble and they kill 300 more men. So they're really quite thorough. Again, they don't take any of the plunder. I don't know who the plunder ends up with. Probably it actually goes to the government, since their families would have probably been killed as well. So that may be incentivizing the king to continue to allow this to happen on some level at least. But in any event, they are successful. It would seem at that point they've managed to get rid of all of the bad apples, so to speak, in Susa, and to set themselves up in a much better position going forward. So, okay, somebody read for me verses 16 through 17.
Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. But they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made a great day of feasting and gladness.
Okay, so they got all their work done in one day, and then they have a day of feasting and rejoicing at that point. 75,000 people is a lot of people. You know, one of the things that is sometimes troubling when you read the Old Testament is the loss of life that takes place, whether it's Jews that lose their Israelites that lose their lives, or whether it's the opponents of the Israelites that lose their lives. 75,000 people would be considered a genocide by most modern standards, especially since it's targeted against specific groups, and most likely there's a degree of ethnicity that's functioned into those groups. But even if it's not, killings that are motivated by religion or what's the other one I'm looking for? It's not ethnicity, it's, what's that?
Economics.
Well, economics, but what I'm thinking of is religion or, actually the word I'm looking for is something that's like a quasi-religious basis. I can't remember the word. Killings that are targeted for those reasons are considered genocides if you kill enough people, and 75,000 is enough people. And so one of the things that we have to sort of deal with in the Old Testament is the fact that there are more than one occasions when God authorizes the Israelites to engage in what would, by any modern definition, be considered genocide. And I've had people ask me about that and point out to me that is a problem. And certainly it is something we do have to address, or at least we have to understand. And we can't deny it. I mean, you could try to argue that, but you're probably going to lose an argument, particularly if you step away from this particular situation and you look at, for example, the commandment that Samuel gave to Saul with regard to the Amalekites. That is a specific ethnic group, and he was told to kill all of them, men, women, and children. That's definitely genocide. And so when we deal with that, or when we recognize that, it's something that we need to talk about a little bit. Ken?
One of the things, though, that mitigates against what you just said is if you add it all together and divide by the number of provinces, it's only 600 in each province on average. Okay, and it's a big country. And if you look at it as a percentage of the total population, I don't know that calling it genocide is perhaps the most accurate way to look at it.
It might not be. I'm simply telling you that by the modern definition of genocide, it would definitely be considered that. It doesn't matter how far you space it out. If you are killing off a specific group of people for religious reasons, it's genocide if you kill enough of them. And by enough of them, it doesn't even take that many. A few thousand is considered genocide, considering what some of the things that have happened in northern Iraq and in northern China and some of those kinds of places. So you're right, it's spaced out, but nevertheless, there's enough of this that takes place. And again, we also recognize this, we should look at this in the larger context, that there are multiple situations, particularly when the Israelites are sent into Canaan, that they are ordered, not just authorized, but ordered to eliminate entire races of people because of the threat spiritually that those people pose to the Israelites if they are continued to allow to exist.
Well, and just counterpoint in this scenario, the 75,000 people that were killed here just waged war on them.
Well, they were ready to.
They were ready to.
Yeah.
So it's like...
Well, that's one of the tricky aspects of genocide, is that a lot of times one side starts it and the other side finishes it, you know. And I think, remember, the part of this is not simply go after the exact people who are attacking you, it's go after their families and kill them all off.
Right.
And again, when we take it into the larger context of looking at some of the Old Testament passages when the Israelites enter into the land of Canaan, it's clear, it seems clear to me at least, that this is a continuation of that policy and that approach where you wipe out everybody who's a threat to you. And in the case of the Canaanites, it was both militarily and spiritually. In this case, it's more of a political and long-term stability kind of a situation. But in either case, it ought to impact our understanding of God and what we think about God's morality and understanding of morality, to recognize that these are things that are done with His blessing or even by His command. And so some of the assumptions that we make, for example, about the value of human life, I would argue are challenged significantly by these kinds of events, both here and earlier in the Jewish history. And so we make some assumptions about God always values human life. Well, not always, you know. Sometimes God values other things more than human life. Now, I'm not saying He ever doesn't value human life, but there are definitely times when He values other things more than human life. The survival of His chosen people in this situation, the elimination of the threat of sin and temptation to His chosen people in previous situations. These are bigger picture items than just the death of human beings. So,
just to expand that point a little bit, you know, the Old Testament is supposed to be our tutor or guide. And when you think about the righteousness of God and the wrath of God, that becomes an example for us. Here's people, I mean, God never demanded the killing of this number of people without justification on one side or the other. I mean, it may have been the Israelites that got killed, but it was because they did not keep God's word. And God says, here's a command, you obey it, I'll treat you well. You don't obey it, I'm going to wipe you out. And that, you know, you look at some of those people that refused to help the Israelites when they were in their journey from Egypt. And, you know, generations later, God wipes them out for that exact reason. I mean, it may not have been the same people involved, but the justification of that becomes an example for us. God means what he says.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point that it's not the same ones who actually did the things that sometimes suffer the consequences of them. God talks about the sins of the fathers falling upon the sons, and sometimes that is a consequential thing simply because of the way things work. Yeah. Sometimes that is by direct intervention of God to make those consequences happen. Mark, did I see you raising your hand?
I was going to say, it flies in the face of a lot of people who look at God like they want to put him in a certain place where he won't send people to hell. He won't make that final judgment. But this really tells you that he will. Yeah. This is my commands. This is what I want you to do and how I want you to live. If you don't, there is consequences. And I'll make sure that the consequences are followed through with. And I think that a lot of people don't want that because they don't want to change their lives and live like they should. So, you know what I mean? Yeah. Here it tells you, this is what I want, and I'm going to take care of it one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think a perfect example of that is when Uzzah reached up to catch the ark when it was going to fall. And I mean, he was just doing that as, you know, to protect it there and keep it from falling. And he was struck down by God. So, you know, that says you obey my commands or else.
Right.
And he doesn't mess around sometimes, you know, and give you second chances or these, you know, say, I warned you.
Yeah, and I think that's the most, to me, the most critical thing for us to come away from this with is, and the reason I'm bringing it up at all is to because this does speak to the fact that we cannot simply, that the argument that people make that, as Mark says, that God is just, he's a loving God, surely he's not going to punish, you know, the overwhelming majority of people in the world aren't going to go to hell because they were disobedient. You know, that's just not right. That's not fair. Well, you can think whatever you want about whether it's right or whether it's fair, but it's definitely within God's character. So you may want to define your morality differently than that, but the guy who's in charge defines it a different way, and he's doing something different. And when we recognize that, it does, I think, affect, or should at least affect, the way that we look at the importance of spreading the gospel, and the importance of making sure that people are aware of what God has demonstrated his character to be. And again, we may not always understand why that's true. And it may also impact the way we understand other kinds of issues, such as, you know, going to war and dealing with losses of life and things like that. But at the core of it, it speaks to the fact that God has a plan, and if you get in the way of that plan, he will run over you, and that's an inevitability. It's not a question of if. So, all right, we need to stop. We're a little over time. Thank you guys for your participation, and we will continue next week. We'll probably have a couple of weeks left on this before we're done.